There was a time I truly believed I still had it, that quiet presence, that subtle gravity that didn't need to speak loudly to be felt. I wasn't trying to be the flashiest man in the room, but I thought I still had the kind of energy that made a younger woman pause, look twice, maybe even lean in. I told myself I'd aged well, that I still had the sharpness, the stories, the scars that made me interesting. And in many ways, that was true. Until one night, I found myself sitting across from someone who reminded me of something I hadn't felt in years, the desire to be impressive. Not respected, not understood, just impressive. It was subtle. She was young, vibrant, a little wild in that magnetic way that youth wears without knowing it. She smiled like life hadn't tested her yet, spoke like she expected the world to bend a little. And when she turned that effortless attention toward me, I felt something stir, something I hadn't expected. At first, it felt good. Hell, it felt great. That surge of relevance, that dopamine high that says, you've still got it. But what followed wasn't pride. It wasn't clarity. It was compromise. Tiny at first. I laughed more than I usually would. I skipped over parts of my past I wasn't sure she'd relate to. I avoided truths that felt too heavy, chose lighter words, leaned into her energy instead of standing firm in my own. I watched myself in real time start to perform, not because she asked me to, not because she demanded anything, but because deep down, I wanted to be chosen. And that's when I realized something that cut deeper than I was ready to admit. I wasn't trying to connect. I was trying to earn. That realization didn't come in a dramatic way. There was no argument, no rejection, no harsh moment of truth. It came later, alone, when I stood in front of my bathroom mirror. Same face, same age lines, same eyes staring back at me. But something had shifted. I didn't feel like a man who had stood tall in the presence of a woman. I felt like a man who had slowly, almost invisibly, shrunk. Not because of her, because of me. Because I had abandoned something I used to hold sacred, my frame. See, no one tells you this part. As men, especially as we age, we're told to stay open, to adapt, to prove we're still desirable in a world obsessed with youth. And in that slow burn of needing to stay relevant, we forget that our edge was never in being like them. It was in being nothing like them. Our wisdom, our stillness, our discipline, our refusal to dance for approval. These were the things that used to make us magnetic. But when you stop honoring those traits, when you start chasing her attention instead of commanding it through your presence, something dangerous happens. You lose your edge not because you got old, but because you got needy. That night, I made myself a promise. I said, never again will I bend just to be seen. If I am to be seen, it will be while standing. And if she doesn't see me for who I am, I won't become someone else to earn her eyes. That's not strength. That's performance. That's erosion. And that's not what men like us are here for. If you've ever felt this, even once, if you've ever caught yourself laughing at a joke you didn't find funny, agreeing with something you didn't believe, sending that second text you knew you shouldn't have just to keep her engaged, then you know what I'm talking about. You know the cost. You felt the discomfort afterward. The unease, that quiet voice inside saying, that wasn't me. But it can be again. Because that man, the one who doesn't chase, who doesn't flinch, who doesn't soften his Edges to fit, he's still in you. You haven't lost him. You've just been quieting him to keep the peace. But peace that costs your identity isn't peace at all. It's slow death. This channel, Stoic advice for men, isn't for the man who's trying to win her approval. It's for the man who's ready to reclaim himself, not with anger, not with ego, but with clarity, with control, with the calm, quiet fire that says, I know who I am, and I don't shift for applause. If any part of what I've just shared made something in you sit up, take a breath, look inward, then stay. Because in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 10 patterns that quietly erode a man's power when he deals with a younger woman. And the Stoic path that will help you get that power back, not by doing more, but by doing less. If you're ready to stop performing and start leading, you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to Stoic advice for men. 1. I tried to be her age and lost my edge. I remember the first time. I adjusted my shirt in the mirror and wondered if it looked too mature. Not too formal, not too stiff. Just too much like me. I stood there questioning whether the color made me look older than I wanted to seem. I'd never cared about that before. But that night I did. She was younger, significantly so. That carefree kind of young, where the world still feels wide open and consequences don't stick just yet. And something about her pulled me in, her energy, her ease. That fire behind her eyes that hadn't been dulled by disappointment or reality. I wasn't trying to date her. Not at first. I just wanted to connect, or so I told myself. But that's how it always starts. A subtle shift in how you speak. You drop a reference you wouldn't normally use. Mention a show you've never watched. Pretend to know that new song playing in the background. You don't lie, you just adjust. You round out the edges of your masculinity so you don't seem too rigid. You dim the weight of your years so you don't seem too heavy. You tell yourself it's harmless, that you're just trying to relate, but that's not what's happening. What's really happening is this: you're stepping out of your world and trying to fit into hers. And the moment you do that, you lose the very thing that made you different, the thing that made her curious in the first place. Remember sitting at a rooftop bar with her one evening. She was talking about something, an influencer, a trend, some drama on TikTok, and I laughed and nodded as if I understood. I even repeated one of the phrases she used earlier, hoping to show that I was listening, that I got it. But in that exact moment, something in her energy changed. She didn't say it out loud, but I saw it in her eyes. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a guy trying to relate. And that shift, once it happens, is almost impossible to reverse. Here's what I've learned since then. A younger woman isn't drawn to you because you're like her. She's drawn to you because you're not. You've lived. You've failed. You've risen again. You carry an energy she hasn't touched yet. A presence that doesn't flinch. A rhythm that isn't desperate to be included. That contrast is what pulls her in. It's not your references, your jokes, your style. It's the fact that you're rooted in a world she doesn't fully understand but instinctively respects. If you don't dilute it trying to impress her, the paradox is brutal. The more you try to be relatable, the more invisible you become. Because here's what she senses beneath the surface. It's not your age gap, it's your insecurity. It's not that you don't know her world, it's that you don't seem to love your own. And no matter how good your intentions are, no matter how Subtle you think you're being, she feels it. Women, especially younger ones, have a sixth sense for emotional incongruence. They don't need logic to spot weakness. They feel it in how you lean in, how you try a little too hard, how you shrink when you should be still. I learned that the hard way, but I also learned the way out. You don't need to speak her language. You need to speak your truth. You don't need to follow her rhythm. You need to keep your own. Imagine this. You're at dinner. She brings up a pop trend, some influencer. Drama, you don't pretend. You don't fake it. You just smile and say, I don't really follow that stuff. I'm more into things that last longer than a 24-hour story. Just one sentence, calm, clean, clear. And just like that, the dynamic shifts again. Because you're not performing, you're leading. The Stoics understood this long before TikTok was even a concept. Marcus Aurelius didn't chase relevance. He chased alignment with reason, with discipline, with the quiet dignity of a man who needs no audience. That's the spirit we've lost. And it's the one we need back. I'm not telling you to be cold. I'm telling you to be rooted. Let her swirl with her youthful energy. Let her dance around you with her trends, her stories, her chaos. But you stay still, still like a mountain. Still like a man who knows that his world, his rhythm, his wisdom, his presence isn't something to be edited or trimmed down to win temporary interest. You are not her peer. And that's not a disadvantage. It's your edge. And when you forget that, you don't just lose her respect. You lose your own. Comment below if you've ever caught yourself performing when you should have been present. And if you're done shrinking just to be liked, subscribe. This isn't a channel for men trying to fit in. It's a path for men ready to stand out. This is Stoic advice for men, and this is just the beginning. 2. I became her emotional dumping ground. At first, I told myself it was connection, those long midnight conversations, the way she confided in me when no one else seemed to understand, the way her voice dropped when she started talking about her father, her ex, her anxiety, the way her eyes searched for comfort in mine like I was her last safe place left in the world, and I foolishly believed that being there for her, absorbing it all, holding space for her emotional storms without flinching, somehow made me special. Somehow meant I was different from the rest of the men in her life who didn't get her, who didn't know how to listen, who didn't offer the stability she claimed she always wanted. I thought I was building something real, but what I was really building was a trap with me inside it. Because here's the truth. That took me far too long to face. I wasn't her partner, I wasn't her equal, and I sure as hell wasn't her lover. I was her emotional sponge. The man she ran to when her life felt too heavy, when her emotions spilled over, when her other relationships collapsed, when the men she actually wanted failed to show up, while I sat on the sideline, nodding, supporting, consoling, thinking that if I just kept being patient, kept being kind, kept showing up with the right words and the calm energy, eventually she'd see it. Eventually she'd realize I was the one, the man who truly understood her, the man she needed not just to talk to, but to choose. But that moment never came, because emotional intimacy without romantic respect is a trap. It's a trap that feels meaningful while it slowly drains you of energy, time, boundaries, and masculine polarity. And no one tells you this, especially if you're the older man, the calm one, the wise one in the dynamic. because everyone assumes you're in control, that you know what you're doing, that you're choosing this role on purpose when, in reality, you're just hoping that by being everything she says she needs, you'll eventually become everything she wants. But women, especially younger ones, don't fall in love with men who absorb their chaos. They fall in love with men who hold their frame in spite of it. And there's a massive difference between being emotionally available and being emotionally absorbent. Between being present and being pulled under, between offering grounded presence and becoming the soft pillow she cries on when another man breaks her heart. The hard truth is, I wasn't creating emotional closeness, I was offering emotional labor, unpaid, unrecognized, and ultimately unrewarded. She didn't respect me more because I listened. She relied on me more because I didn't set limits. And every time I answered that 1 a.m. call, every time I let her vent for 2 hours without asking what she actually planned to do about it, every time I softened my tone to soothe her breakdowns, I was reinforcing the one message I should have never sent. You can use me to process your life, and I won't ask for anything in return. And at some point, she believed me, because she stopped asking what I needed. She stopped noticing how tired I looked. She stopped wondering why I always made time for her, even when she didn't make space for me, because I had made myself available, endlessly mistaking self-sacrifice for strength, mistaking access for intimacy. But presence isn't sacrifice, and calm is not the same as consent. Stoic strength isn't about absorbing everyone else's chaos. It's about being the one man who can stay centered without losing himself in someone else's emotional waves. It's the difference between being a lighthouse and being a sponge. One stands, the other soaks. And if you're not careful, you'll soak so much of her pain, her confusion, her unmet needs, that you'll end up carrying the emotional weight that was never yours to bear in the first place. Until one day you realize you don't even know what peace feels like anymore, because you've tied your sense of worth to how needed you are in someone else's storm. I remember the moment it changed for me. She called me crying again about another guy. Another disappointment. Another moment where life didn't go her way. And for the first time, instead of offering comfort, advice, or distraction, I simply said, "That sounds like a lot. I hope you give yourself the space to figure it out." And then I went to sleep. I didn't stay up waiting for a response. I didn't check in the next morning. I didn't chase her emotional state like it was my job to fix it. And you know what happened? She pulled away for a while. And for the first time, I didn't panic, because I realized if someone's presence in your life depends on your emotional availability without limits, then they're not choosing you, they're using you. Since then, I've learned to listen without absorbing, to care without carrying, to be present without being pulled under. And most of all, I've learned that a man's peace is not a gift he gives away to earn love. It's the standard he holds so that love can be real, not transactional. If you've ever found yourself drained after a conversation that didn't involve you, exhausted from carrying emotions that weren't yours, stuck in a role you didn't ask for but kept performing anyway, then it's time to reclaim your ground. Comment below, "I protect my peace," if you've had enough of being her therapist, her pillow, her late-night emotional crutch. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men if you're done confusing emotional labor with connection and ready to build relationships where your calm isn't taken for granted, but respected. 3. I needed her approval, and she felt it. There was a time not so long ago when I started to wait for her replies, not because I was bored or curious, but because something in me was now tethered to her response time, as if the speed of her attention determined the weight of my worth that day. It began subtly, as these things always do, an unanswered message left too long, followed by a glance at my phone more times than I'd like to admit, a little knot in my chest that I tried to rationalize as just being considerate when, in fact, it was a growing dependence on her validation to feel secure in myself. What's worse is that I began adjusting, not just my tone or my words, but my values. I started softening my truths, avoiding disagreement, agreeing with things I didn't fully believe in, not because I had changed, but because I feared losing whatever thin thread of connection I thought we had. I told myself I was being supportive. I told myself I was being open-minded. But the truth was simpler and far less noble. I was shrinking. I became careful in my honesty, strategic in my silence, and slowly I traded authenticity for approval one knot at a time. I told myself that love requires compromise. That understanding means meeting her halfway, even if halfway meant leaving behind pieces of who I was. I started filtering my masculinity so it wouldn't feel too much, editing my decisiveness so it wouldn't seem controlling, dimming my expectations so they wouldn't make her uncomfortable. I thought I was creating space for love. I thought I was making her feel safe, but in reality, I was creating the very dynamic that would eventually unravel everything. Because here's what I've learned painfully, and more than once: women don't leave you because you're not enough. They leave because you've stopped being who you were, not because you failed to impress them, but because you started trying too hard to do just that. You see, when you begin chasing her approval, when your self-respect is slowly outsourced to her opinion, her attention, her emotional tone, you become a performer, not a man. You stop leading and start pleasing. You don't stand in your truth anymore. You orbit her moods, waiting for the next cue. And the moment she senses that shift, and trust me, she will, something inside her pulls away, even if she doesn't fully understand why. Because what she's feeling isn't disappointment, it's dissonance. It's that deep, intuitive sense that says, this man doesn't trust his own spine anymore. And when that trust disappears, so does the polarity, so does the mystery, so does the respect. That's the paradox most men never see coming. The more you try to be agreeable, the more invisible you become. And if you're older like I am, that loss is even more costly. Because you don't have youth to hide behind. You don't have time to waste performing. What you do have, what you should have, is the quiet certainty of a man who doesn't need to win someone over to feel complete. But when you forget that, when you start compromising your presence to buy comfort, you don't just lose her, you lose your edge. I remember one evening, we were out to dinner and she said something that rubbed me the wrong way, something that contradicted one of my core values. And instead of speaking my mind, I smiled, nodded, and let the moment pass. Later that night I couldn't sleep. Not because of her, but because I had just witnessed myself abandon a piece of who I was. For what? A peaceful evening? A smoother date? The illusion of connection? That's when it hit me. Peace that requires self-erasure is not peace. It's slow self-abandonment dressed up as harmony. And here's the part that most men miss. She can feel that dot. She can feel when you're not being fully honest. She can feel when you're too eager to please. She can feel when your words are polished but your center is gone. And she doesn't admire you for it. She tests you for it. She pulls away. She grows colder. Not because you said the wrong thing, but because she can no longer feel your gravity the moment you put her opinion above your integrity. She stops seeing you as the man she was drawn to and starts seeing you as a man trying not to lose her. That's not love. That's fear. And no woman, especially one who is still figuring herself out, wants to carry the weight of being the center of your self-worth. It's not romantic. It's suffocating. So what's the Stoic way? You don't seek her approval. You live in alignment with your own. You speak your truth, not to impress, not to provoke, but because it's yours. You allow disagreement. You allow distance. You allow her to walk away if your truth is too much. Because a man who stands in who he is doesn't fear who he might lose. And ironically, that's what makes you most attractive, not your flexibility, but your solidity. Comment below, I speak from center, if you're done filtering yourself just to keep someone interested. And if you're ready to lead not through charm, not through validation, but through calm, grounded presence. Subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, where we don't chase approval. We stand in truth. 4. I performed when I should have led. There was a phase when I thought I was doing everything right. The carefully crafted messages, the thoughtful emojis timed just right to show warmth without overstepping. The restaurant reservations made with precision, the playlist curated for our drives, the small gifts I left at the perfect moment, unexpected but never random, always tied to something she'd mentioned once in passing. I was, by every modern standard, a man who paid attention, a man who showed effort, a man who made her feel seen, and yet she pulled away, not with anger, not even with clear words, but with that quiet erosion that starts in her eyes when they stop holding curiosity for you, with the slower replies, the scattered energy, the "I've just been busy" messages that don't feel like lies, but also don't feel like truth. I didn't understand it at first. I had done everything I was told women wanted. I had been attentive, emotionally intelligent, communicative, generous, thoughtful. I had performed the role of a good man almost perfectly. And that was the problem. Because what I didn't realize was that every carefully planned move, every overscripted gesture, every calculated text was eroding something much deeper than I knew. It was eroding my presence. You see, when a man performs instead of leads, when his every action is filtered through the question, will this make her like me more? He stops being a grounded, masculine force and starts becoming an entertainer. And while entertainment can be charming for a while, it is never respected in the long term. It doesn't build tension. It doesn't anchor her. It doesn't lead. It impresses. But it doesn't move. And women don't fall in love with what merely impresses them. They fall for what shakes them, what grounds them, what challenges them to rise. They crave a presence that doesn't apologize for its depth, that doesn't need to juggle or dance to win their gaze, but simply stands, directs, and moves with clarity. Looking back, I wasn't leading. I was auditioning, hoping my performance would earn me a role in her life, hoping my gestures would deserve her loyalty. But what I couldn't see back then was that the very act of trying to be impressive was the most unattractive energy I could bring, because when you shift from being grounded to being performative, you give her the frame. You make her the judge. You become the one hoping to be chosen, instead of the one choosing who is allowed into your space. And the energy underneath all of that, the dinners, the gifts, the curated words, is not strength, it's fear. Fear of not being enough just as you are. Fear of rejection if you don't entertain. Fear that without flash, you'll be forgotten. But the truth is, real masculinity doesn't entertain. It commands, not through force, not through manipulation, but through unwavering direction. A man who leads doesn't ask, "What would she like me to say?" He simply says what needs to be said. He doesn't text to keep her engaged. He texts because he has something real to communicate. He doesn't schedule plans to prove he's romantic. He sets the frame because he knows the power of certainty. And if she aligns with it, great. If she doesn't, he keeps moving. I remember the first time I stopped performing. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small shift. She asked, "What do you feel like doing this weekend?" And instead of flipping the question back or trying to guess what she wanted, I just said, "I'll be doing this. You're welcome to join if it fits your flow." No smiley face, no emoji, no explanation. Just clarity, and something changed. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, because I had stopped trying to impress and started to embody. That's the moment you become magnetic, not when you shine your armor, but when you stand in it, unapologetically. Stoics didn't speak of charisma, they spoke of alignment. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Why? Because truth doesn't beg to be liked. It simply is. And a man who leads with truth will always be more respected than the man who leads with tactics. So I'll tell you this now. Stop scripting. Stop asking what will make her like you. Start asking, "What's true to me?" And say that. Because the man who impresses might get her attention for a night. But the man who leads quietly, clearly, consistently, he stays in her mind long after she's scrolled past 100 others. Comment, "I move with direction" below if you're done playing the role of the perfect guy and ready to reclaim the presence of a man who doesn't need permission to lead. And if you're ready to stop performing altogether, subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men. Because here, we don't chase love. We walk our path and let love follow us. 5. I got addicted to the fantasy. It's strange how quickly a mind, especially one that has known solitude for long enough, can begin to build castles out of moments, entire futures out of glances, and emotional intimacy out of nothing more than the simple high of possibility. Because after just a few encounters, after a handful of shared drinks and easy laughter, after hearing her talk about her dreams and watching the way she brushed her hair behind her ear when she listened, I found myself caught in a web I hadn't even realized I was spinning, one woven not by her intentions, but by my own unconscious hunger for something meaningful, something lasting, something beautiful to place into the pages of a life that had, for too long, felt composed mostly of chapters about building, sacrificing, and waiting. I didn't fall in love with her. I fell in love with what could be, with an image that I painted more carefully than I've ever painted anything in my life, using every color from my imagination, every brushstroke drawn from past hopes and unmet longing, creating a version of her that was more attuned to my desires than to who she actually was in front of me. And it wasn't until much later, when the frame started cracking, that I realized how much I had invested, not in her character, not in our shared values, not even in how we moved through tension, but in a projection that existed solely within the confines of my own mind. I saw us traveling together, building a life, laughing through hard moments, growing more aligned over time, even though the real version of her was still showing up inconsistently, texting sporadically, pulling away without explanation, and displaying flashes of immaturity that I excused as youth or nervousness or just her process. Because once you fall into fantasy, everything real becomes negotiable, everything contradictory becomes explainable, and every signal she sends that doesn't match your vision gets quickly reinterpreted as a challenge to overcome, rather than a truth to accept that. And the more I imagined what could be, the less I observed what was, how her effort didn't match her words, how her curiosity only emerged when it served her comfort, how her presence often came with absence just behind it, and yet I stayed emotionally tethered, clinging to potential, believing that if I just held steady long enough, she would become the person I saw in my mind, the version I had convinced myself was waiting beneath her hesitation. But the hard truth I had to face, the one I had been avoiding in the name of romantic optimism, was that I wasn't in a relationship, I was in a story I had written. And she was merely the placeholder I was using to keep the plot moving forward, hoping that if I turned enough pages, reality would catch up with my imagination, and everything would eventually align. Not because it was right, but because I wanted it to be. And so I tolerated the mixed signals, the subtle disrespect, the lack of reciprocity, not because I didn't see it, but because I was afraid that if I let go of the fantasy, I'd have to admit that I had once again fallen for an illusion, that all the emotional investment, all the time spent, all the hope placed in the wrong direction would mean nothing. And that kind of emotional loss, losing a future that only existed in my head, can feel just as heavy, if not more so, than losing something real. But Stoicism teaches us that we suffer not from what happens, but from our interpretation of what happens. And in this case, I wasn't suffering because she left, or because things didn't work out. I was suffering because I had clung to a vision rather than engaging with the moment. Because I had traded observation for imagination. And once you do that, you stop seeing clearly. And clarity, above all, is a man's greatest tool for navigating both love and loss. Stoic doesn't build futures on unstable ground. A Stoic doesn't commit to someone's potential before they've proven their present. A Stoic doesn't get addicted to what might be. He sits in what is, no matter how uncomfortable that reality may be. And the truth was, she wasn't ready. She wasn't aligned. She wasn't investing. She wasn't evolving. She wasn't the version I had hoped she would become, and that isn't her fault. That was mine, because I created that version. I gave her the traits. I gave her the patience. I gave her the emotional access. And I never stopped to ask whether she had earned any of it. So now, I pay attention. I don't dream about where we could go until I've seen how she walks beside me today. I don't envision a life with someone before I've seen how she handles difficulty, discomfort, or even boredom. I don't let chemistry cloud consistency. I don't let hope override history. I stay rooted. Because a man grounded in truth doesn't need fantasy to feel full. Comment below. I choose clarity. If you've ever found yourself emotionally hooked on a woman who only existed inside your imagination, and if you're ready to stop falling in love with projections and start living with your eyes wide open, subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, because here we don't chase illusions, we master reality. 6. I became her backup plan. It always started with a message, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the middle of a long afternoon, always with that same familiar tone of emotional weight, of someone reaching out, not because they had space to give, but because they suddenly had a void to fill. And for reasons I didn't fully understand back then, I kept answering, kept picking up the phone, kept rearranging my day, my energy, and eventually my boundaries to make room for a woman who only seemed to remember I existed when the world had disappointed her. She would text when she was low, when something had gone wrong, when her plans had fallen through, or when the man she really wanted had gone silent again. And in those moments, I became the comfort, warm, responsive, grounded, always ready with understanding, always available to listen, always present without question or condition. And in return, she gave me the illusion of connection. But when life was light, when her calendar was full, when she was laughing on weekends and glowing in her Instagram stories, I disappeared, not in words, but in presence, in relevance, in the invisible ranking system of her priorities. And still, I stayed, convincing myself that this inconsistency was just a phase, that she needed time, that I was being patient. That real connection often comes in strange waves, but what I refused to admit, what I buried under layers of rationalization and emotional maturity, was the very thing that defined our dynamic from the start. I wasn't her choice. I was her cushion. I was the emotional airbag she deployed when the crash came, the soft place she landed when everything else felt too sharp, the man who made her feel seen just enough to keep me close, but never enough to bring me in fully. And the most painful part of all was how I mistook this role for progress. Told myself that being there for her in her hardest moments would eventually make me irreplaceable. That by listening without judgment, by holding her without expectation, I was building something slow and deep and lasting. But what I was really doing was shrinking myself into a placeholder, someone who was safe enough to lean on but never compelling enough to choose. And that realization didn't come through some grand betrayal or dramatic exit. It came in the quiet moments when I looked at my phone and realized that I had become someone she could forget when life was good, but always remembered the second it wasn single quotes d. And once you see that pattern, once you connect the dots between her silence and her satisfaction, between her affection and her loneliness, you can't unsee it. And the only question left is whether you'll keep playing the role she's written for you, or whether you'll walk away from the stage entirely. Because here's the truth: a man isn't meant to be a fallback plan, an emotional sponge, or the invisible net she keeps just in case the high wire snaps. A man, especially one who has earned his calm through years of failure and rebuilding, should never allow himself to become someone else's. Maybe because every time you answer the call that wasn't meant for you, every time you provide comfort without commitment, every time you allow yourself to be accessible on her terms and invisible on your own, you're not just betraying your standards, you're teaching her how to treat you. And women, even the kindest ones, will unconsciously learn to devalue what they never had to earn. especially when that presence comes without boundaries, without clarity, without the weight of masculine self-respect anchoring it. I remember the night. I finally saw it clearly. She had just finished telling me about another man, someone she was unsure of, someone who didn't respond consistently, someone who stirred something wild in her, and I listened, calmly, like I always did, nodding, offering thoughts when asked, absorbing her frustration, her confusion, her longing, and somewhere in the middle of it all, she paused, looked at me softly, and said, "You're just such a safe place." And something inside me snapped, not in anger, not in resentment, but in recognition, because she wasn't praising me. She was labeling me. And I realized in that moment that safe wasn't the compliment I had once thought it was. It was the confirmation that I had allowed myself to be used as a form of emotional maintenance, not chosen as a man to build something with. That night, I withdrew, not in anger, not with dramatic closure, but with quiet resolve. The most powerful move a man can make is to stop making himself available where he's not genuinely valued. And sure enough, weeks later, she reached out again, with that same tone, that same need, that same emotional gravity. But this time, I didn't answer, not because I hated her, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had remembered who I was, and that memory was stronger than her moment of need. And she felt it. Because when a man stops being the fallback, when he no longer absorbs pain that wasn't his to carry, when he no longer shows up just to keep someone else from falling, he becomes something far more rare, far more respected, and far more powerful. A man with standards. So if you've ever felt like the one who's always available but never truly seen, the one who listens to stories about other men while quietly hoping your turn will come, the one who's confused support with connection and presence with value, then let this be the last time. Comment. I won't be her option if you've had enough of being the emotional stand-in for someone who only remembers you when she's hurting. And if you're ready to be more than a backup plan, to reclaim the dignity of presence that doesn't beg to be noticed, subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, where we don't wait to be chosen, we choose ourselves first. 7. I stepped off my path, and she lost respect. It didn't happen all at once. And that's what made it so dangerous. Because if I had woken up one day and suddenly decided to abandon everything I had built, everything I valued, everything that made me who I was, perhaps I would have noticed the betrayal. Perhaps I would have had the clarity to stop myself. But when the erosion happens slowly, when each compromise feels small and well-intentioned, when the shift is wrapped in the warm, convincing language of showing up or being available, you don't see it as surrender. You see it as love. And that's exactly what I told myself the first time I skipped the gym to stay in bed a little longer with her. The first time I delayed a project because she needed to talk. The first time I pulled out of a weekend with my closest friends. To be there, just in case she needed company, because surely that's what a good man does, right? He makes time, he adjusts. He shows her that she matters. So I made room. More and more room. I softened my structure, softened my focus, softened the parts of me that once stood tall and unshakable. And I did it not because she demanded it, she never had to. I did it because some part of me believed that making her the center of my orbit would deepen our connection, that proving my availability would earn her admiration, that sacrificing parts of my routine, my discipline, my mission, was just a necessary step in building something real. But what I didn't realize, what most men don't realize until it's too late, is that the moment you abandon your path to prove your affection, the moment you stop moving forward in your own direction and begin rearranging your life around someone else's presence, you stop being the man she was drawn to in the first place. Because women, especially those who are still discovering who they are, aren't magnetized by comfort, by availability, by sacrifice masquerading as romance. They're drawn to fire, to purpose, to movement, to men who carry their mission like a spine that doesn't bend, who walk with direction so steady that even love has to catch up if it wants to come along. And the more I stepped off my path, the more I paused my goals, the more I delayed my priorities, the more I made her mood the compass of my decisions, the more something subtle but irreversible happened in her gaze. The light of respect began to dim. She didn't say it outright. She didn't have to. It showed up in the way she responded, the way she questioned my seriousness, the way she grew distant, not because I was absent, but because I had become too present in the wrong way. I was no longer the builder. I was the follower, no longer the man she had to rise to meet. I had descended to meet her instead. And the cruel irony is that in trying to keep her close, I had done the one thing guaranteed to push her away. I had stopped leading. The Stoics spoke endlessly about the importance of discipline, not as punishment, but as preservation, because a man without structure becomes a man without self, and I had become that man. Slowly, silently, convinced that proximity and attention could replace edge and ambition. And when she finally left, when her texts became colder, her replies shorter, her energy more distracted, I didn't feel shocked. I felt exposed, because deep down, I knew I had handed her the map to my direction, the weight of my momentum, and expected her to carry both, when the truth is, no woman wants to carry a man's path for him. She wants to feel it under his feet. So I stopped blaming her. I stopped asking what went wrong. I stopped rewinding conversations looking for signs. I stopped wondering what more I could have done. And I looked at the real cause. I had abandoned the version of myself that was leading, and she simply followed me into that quiet collapse. From that day forward, I returned to the path not out of spite, not to prove anything, not to win her back, but because I understood, finally and deeply, that when a man is not in motion, he is in decline, and when he makes a woman his focus instead of his mission, he loses both. So now, I move forward. I train, even when no one's watching. I build, even if no one claps. I rise early. I work with purpose. I reconnect with my brothers. I sharpen my vision, not to impress her, or any woman, but to stay aligned with who I've always been at my best. A man who walks with fire, not one who waits for permission. Comment, I stay on mission if you've ever stepped off your path to keep someone close and learned, the hard way, that she respected you more when you were fully committed to your own direction. And if you're ready to stop proving your worth through sacrifice and start embodying it through focus, subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, where we don't lose ourselves for love. We lead and let love find us on the way. 8. I bent too much. She stopped trusting me. I thought I was being kind when I let the little things slide, when I adjusted my tone to avoid sounding too firm, when I said yes to plans I didn't want, agreed with opinions I didn't share, or held back truths that might stir discomfort, because I believed that flexibility, that willingness to accommodate, to bend just slightly in her direction, would show her that I was not like other men, that I was mature, emotionally intelligent, and above all, safe. I told myself that bending was understanding, that giving a little ground meant I was building trust, that the more I made space for her needs, even if it came at the quiet cost of my own, the more she would see me as dependable, considerate, real. But what I didn't realize at the time, what I failed to understand until the consequences were already in motion, was that every time I shrank a little to keep the peace, every time I nodded along instead of speaking my truth, every time I smoothed over a boundary to avoid friction, wasn't making her feel more secure. I was making her feel less sure of me, because while I thought I was creating connection, what I was actually doing was eroding certainty. And women, whether they say it out loud or not, don't trust men who wobble. They don't trust the man who agrees too quickly, who compromises too easily, who smiles in the face of disrespect, or who molds himself into whatever version he thinks will keep her from pulling away. Because no matter how well you hide it, no matter how polite, how agreeable, how emotionally polished you become, she can feel the absence of spine, the lack of edge, the quiet betrayal of principle happening just beneath the surface of your nice guy exterior. And when that happens, when she starts sensing that your calm isn't grounded in strength, but in fear of disapproval, something in her shifts slowly, subtly, but decisively. She begins to test, not out of malice, not because she's cruel or manipulative, but because she needs to know if you mean what you say, if your boundaries are real, if your yes means yes and your no means no, or if you're just another man who folds the second he senses emotional withdrawal. And if you keep bending, if you continue to flinch every time she raises her voice, withdraws her attention, or challenges your position, you're not showing her depth. You're showing her that your values are negotiable. And a man whose values are negotiable can never be trusted fully, because if he won't protect his own line, how can he be trusted to protect hers? I remember a conversation we had, one that still echoes in my mind, not because of what she said, but because of what I didn't. She had crossed a boundary I had once considered non-negotiable. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just a subtle form of disrespect wrapped in sarcasm. And rather than addressing it, rather than meeting it with calm clarity, I smiled, shrugged, and told myself it wasn't a big deal. But it was, because in that moment, I didn't just let it go, I let myself go. And even though she didn't say anything at the time, I could feel the shift. Her energy changed. The way she looked at me changed. Not because I had failed to be nice, but because I had failed to be solid. And when a man fails to be solid, the relationship begins to crumble, whether either of you sees it yet or not. Because a woman doesn't fall in love with your ability to accommodate. She falls in love with your ability to stand calmly, firmly, without flinching, even when she pushes, even when she tests, even when she tries, consciously or not, to see just how much of yourself you're willing to give away to keep her comfortable. The more I bent, the less she trusted me, not because I wasn't good to her, but because I wasn't good to myself. And when a man starts violating his own standards, he teaches the people around him to do the same. That's the paradox. The more you aim to be agreeable, the more you teach her that your truth isn't strong enough to anchor hers. And so I stopped, not out of anger, not as a game, but because I finally saw that respect doesn't grow in the space where everything is allowed. It grows in the space where clarity lives, where boundaries are not threats but invitations to something real, something trustworthy. And trust, I've learned, doesn't come from the absence of conflict, that it comes from the presence of spine. So now, I speak plainly. I say no when I mean it, not because I want control, but because I've learned that my peace, my standards, my self-respect are not tokens to be traded for temporary approval. They are the foundation on which any real connection must be built. Comment, I hold the line, if you've ever felt yourself bending too far for someone who only respected you when you stood tall. And if you're ready to stop mistaking passivity for peace and start embodying the kind of strength that commands quiet trust, subscribe to Stoic advice for men, where men don't yield to win affection, that we lead with boundaries and let trust grow where truth stands. 9. I tried to buy her time, and it backfired. There's a point in every man's story, especially the man who is built, who has earned, who has more to offer than he ever did in his younger years, where he starts to believe, sometimes without even knowing it, that generosity can bridge the gap that emotional presence cannot. That if he gives enough, plans enough, shows up enough, stays available enough, then maybe, just maybe, she'll feel something real, something binding, something worth holding on to. And so I did what many men do when they don't yet realize they're negotiating for affection. I gave time, long evenings I should have spent resting, creating, building quietly, handed over to conversations that left me feeling more drained than seen. Gave attention, the kind that's not divided, not casual, but fully tuned in, as if every word she said mattered more than anything happening inside my own head. I gave presence, not just being physically there, but emotionally attentive, supportive, available in ways I never even thought to be for myself. And yes, I gave money, not in vulgar, flashy ways, not in ways that demanded recognition, but in the soft, quiet generosity that looks thoughtful on the surface. Dinners paid for without hesitation, rides offered without request, small gifts tied to things she mentioned in passing, all delivered with the unspoken hope that she would see my effort and choose to stay. But she didn't, because what I gave her wasn't felt as devotion. It was experienced as desperation, not the dramatic, needy kind that clings too tightly, but the subtle kind that gives too freely, that overextends, that says, I'll do more. Not because she asked, but because some part of me feared that being myself wouldn't be enough. And here's the hard truth most men avoid. You can't buy a woman's respect. And if she only stays because what you offer is convenient, comforting, or costly, then she was never truly with you in the first place. Because no matter how noble your intentions, the energy underneath is what she feels most when your giving is rooted in fear rather than strength. When your presence is trying to fill a gap instead of honoring your own value. When your wallet becomes the way you say, please don't go. She may not call it out directly, but something inside her begins to pull away. Because instinctively, she knows, the moment you try to buy time, you've already lost your place. And that's exactly what happened. The more I gave, the more she expected. The more I showed up, the less it meant. The more I made room, the more she filled it, not with gratitude, but with assumption. I became not a man of value, but a source of convenience. And the tragedy is, I was valuable. I did have something rare to offer, but I made it too easy, too available, too ready to bend without ever asking whether what I was building was being received with intention or just passively consumed. And women don't fall for the man who offers everything on the first try. They fall for the man whose presence feels earned, not handed out. The one who doesn't need to prove his worth because his energy already speaks it before he says a word. Stoicism taught me that true giving begins with restraint, not because we lack generosity, but because we value our essence too much to let it be taken for granted. Marcus Aurelius never spoke about chasing. He spoke about alignment, about self-command, about never wasting what is rare on those who cannot recognize it. And so I stopped giving from fear. I stopped showing up without checking whether I was being seen. I stopped offering energy into spaces that couldn't reflect it back with even a fraction of depth. Because if she only leans in when the dinner's paid for, the plans are made, and the time is freely offered, then she's not there for you. She's there for the benefits of your presence. And that's not love. That's leverage. Now, I move differently. I give to women who show effort, not just interest. I offer attention to those who reciprocate, not because I'm cold, but because I've learned that warmth is only valuable when it's respected. Comment: I don't chase. If you've ever found yourself giving too much too fast, only to realize she never truly wanted you, she just liked what you brought to her table. And if you're done buying time, done earning space, done trading your presence for crumbs of attention, subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, where we don't purchase affection. We live with value and let those who see it earn their way in. 10. I gave my depth to someone who didn't earn it. I've always believed that connection, real, soul-deep connection, starts with truth, and for most of my life, I wore that belief like a badge of honor, offering it freely to those who asked the right questions, who sat across from me with wide eyes and curious smiles, who leaned in just enough to make me feel like I was finally safe to open up. And so when she looked at me that night, with that soft attentiveness, that quiet hunger to know more, I took a breath, and I began to tell her everything. Not everything in the factual sense, but everything that mattered, the pivotal moments, the failures that cracked my foundation, the wounds I still carried without complaint, the dreams I hadn't shared in years, the versions of myself I had spent decades building, breaking, and rebuilding again. And I told myself this was what intimacy looked like. I told myself that honesty required exposure, that vulnerability was strength, that sharing my inner world without hesitation would show her that I was nothing like the boy she'd known before. But in my rush to be real, I forgot something essential, something no Stoic would ever overlook. I forgot that depth, just like trust, must be earned. Because it's not about hiding who you are. It's about discerning who's ready to hold it. And she wasn't. She listened. She smiled. She mirrored what I said with nods and softness. But what I mistook for resonance was only surface-level fascination, the kind of emotional curiosity that feels intimate in the moment, but fades quickly when the novelty wears off. She didn't reject what I said. She just didn't know what to do with it. And it wasn't her fault. It was mine, because I poured my soul into a container that hadn't been tested for leaks. I handed over the keys to the most sacred parts of me before I'd seen how she handled silence, pressure, boredom, or conflict. I gave her access to decades of hard-won clarity after just a few glimpses of charm and laughter. And in doing so, I created a false sense of closeness, not because she demanded it, but because I needed it to be real. But real connection isn't born from rapid emotional exposure. It's revealed slowly, over time, through action, through consistency, through the quiet resilience that shows up in the ordinary, not the dramatic. And when I started to feel her pull away, not abruptly, not rudely, but through distance that grew heavier with each encounter, I didn't feel misunderstood. I felt exposed, because she wasn't walking away from me. She was walking away from something she had never asked to carry. And what I learned in that quiet unraveling was that depth, true, earned, sacred depth, isn't something you offer like a gift to anyone who asks the right questions. It's something you protect, something you share with the few who prove, through patience and presence, that they are capable of holding it. The Stoics speak often of restraint, not as emotional coldness, but as wisdom in motion, because a man who reveals everything too soon is not being vulnerable. He's being careless with his essence. And if your essence is given freely to those who haven't earned your stillness, your trust, your standards, then don't be surprised when they drop it, not out of malice, but because it was never theirs to hold. I remember the last conversation we had before things faded for good. She told me kindly but vaguely that it all just felt too heavy, that she wasn't ready for that kind of emotional depth, that maybe what she needed was something a little lighter, a little easier. And in that moment, I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain. I didn't try to fix it. Because I realized she hadn't rejected my story. She'd just been handed the ending before she was ready to even hold the first page. Since then, I've become slower to share. Not colder, not guarded, just intentional. Now, I observe not how she talks, but how she shows up. Not how curious she is about my past, but how steady she is with her own. Not how quickly she leans in, but how she holds the space when she's there. And when I do open up, I do so not to impress, not to bond quickly, not to feel less alone, but to build carefully, patiently, with someone who has proven that my silence is just as welcome as my voice. Because the most valuable parts of who we are, our clarity, our pain, our vision, our emotional depth, were never meant to be thrown into the hands of someone who merely stirs our attraction. They were meant to be shared with someone who has earned their way into the fire, who respects its heat, and who will not run the moment it flickers unpredictably. Comment: I protect my depth. If you've ever found yourself giving too much, too soon, and learn that your story doesn't lose value when you tell it less, it gains value when you share it right. And if you're ready to stop proving your soul to people who haven't earned your silence, subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, where we don't perform to be understood, we lead with discernment and let the right ones earn what's real. Ben Zach nan jup fanene, niu jiben, Emchen essen trian kai fan kant luen ting the cho chui kuch bene. I didn't lose her, I reclaimed myself. Conclusion: I didn't lose her, I reclaimed myself. For a long time, I thought the greatest tragedy was losing her. The woman who once looked at me like I was everything she didn't know she needed. The one who made me feel alive again, who pulled me out of my stillness and into something that felt electric, unpredictable, thrilling. And when she left, when the calls stopped, when her eyes grew distant and her voice lost its warmth, I believed I had failed, believed I had lost something rare, something meaningful, something irreplaceable. But what I eventually came to understand, slowly, painfully, through the long silence that followed, is that I hadn't lost her. I had finally begun to reclaim myself, because the version of me that loved her was also the version that made quiet compromises, that bit his tongue in the name of peace, that offered more than was asked, that stepped off his path to keep someone close, that bent and gave and shrank and waited, all while calling it love when it was really just fear wearing a softer name. And when she walked away, when she no longer saw the man I was pretending to be, I was forced to confront the fact that I had drifted far from the man I once admired in the mirror, the man who moved with direction, who spoke with clarity, who acted not to impress but to embody. So I made a choice, not to chase her, not to win her back, not to prove anything, but to return to my discipline, to my vision, to my internal compass that had never once steered me wrong before. I started trading purpose for proximity. And what I've come to realize is that the right woman, the one truly meant for the man I've become, won't leave because I stand tall in my standards, because I walk with unwavering focus, because I refuse to dilute my values to make someone feel more comfortable. She won't be intimidated by my strength. She rise in the presence of it. She won't ask me to bend. She admire that I don't. Because women, real women, don't respect men who give everything too easily. They respect men who know what they're building, and who are willing to walk alone until someone proves worthy to walk beside them. So no, I didn't lose her. She was never mine to lose. What I reclaimed was far more valuable. My center, my code, my stillness. And that's the man I am today, not because I won someone's affection, but because I stopped giving mine to the wrong person. If you've ever found yourself abandoning your boundaries just to keep someone interested, if you've ever mistaken sacrifice for connection, if you've ever watched yourself drift further from who you are just to be loved by someone who never truly saw you, then brother, it's time to stop waiting to be chosen and start choosing yourself. It's time to stop chasing, to stop performing, to stop explaining, and to return fully, unapologetically to the man you were born to be. Comment: I lead myself first. If you're done living for approval and ready to live by principle. And if you're serious about walking the path, not for women, not for the world, but for your own integrity, then subscribe to Stoic Advice for Men, where we don't talk about being better just to be liked. We walk with direction, we lead with stillness, and we stand together with men who no longer bend for attention. This isn't a channel. It's a movement.